and it's time to listen to speaking the truth to power. This gentleman who is going to address us today has made his name, carved his own niche in the area of speaking truth to power. Your Excellencies, very distinguished ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to bring to the podium Professor Patrick Lumumba. Professor P.L.O. Lumumba is a professor of public health, a holder of an LLD, Doctor of Laws on the Law of the Sea from the University of Kent, Belgium, Masters of Law degree, and a host, I must say, lots of honorary degrees of Doctors of Law, honoris causa from the University of Cape Coast in Ghana, is a holder of the degree of Doctor of Science, Human Rights at the Institute of Advanced Legal Studies, University of London in England, Humanitarian Law at the Raoul Wallenberg Institute of the University of London, Sweden, and on International Humanitarian Law in Geneva, Switzerland. He is an advocate of the High Courts of Kenya and Tanganyika and a certified mediator. He is a fellow of the Institute of Certified Public Secretaries of Kenya, FCPS, a fellow of the Kenya Institute of Management, and an honorary fellow of the African Academy of Science. He is the chairman of Farafina Investment Group in Monrovia, Liberia, an economic strategic growth and development initiative for Africa based in Nigeria. He is the immediate former director and chief executive officer of the Kenyan School of Law, a former secretary of the Constitution of Kenya Review Commission, and a former director of the defunct Kenya Anti-Corruption Commission. He is the founding trustee of the African Institute for Leaders and Leadership and was the founding dean of Kabarak University School of Law, a former lecturer at the University of Nairobi, the United States International University, and Wider University, USA, Nairobi. I can go on and read about this proud son of Africa, whom I'm honored to introduce to us. I bring to the microphone our brother, Professor P.L.O. Lumumba. Asante.
We welcome you, so thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Let me start by recognizing the chief guest, who is the President of the Federal Republic of Nigeria. Permit me also to recognize the family of the late Dr. Abubakar Olusola Saraki, and permit me for good order to stand on the protocols already established. Let me say how glad, honored, and privileged I am to be invited to deliver a memorial lecture on the 10th anniversary to commemorate the departure of Dr. Abubakar Olusola Saraki. Any keen student of African politics, and I claim to be such a keen student, would have heard of Dr. Saraki, and I had heard of him before this invitation. I'd also had the honor and privilege of meeting Dr. Bukola Saraki when he was the president of the Senate. And he granted me the opportunity to address the Senate then. That is not to forget that my good friend, Brother Bajamila, also granted me a similar occasion in the House of Representatives. I'm glad to deliver a lecture to memorialize an individual of whom it can be said that he was a colossus who bestrode the Nigerian political terrain and made his contribution in a manner that makes it worthy to be remembered favorably. I say so because there is no shortage of individuals who come and go and their memories are not worth much. We have had the honor and privilege of seeing the snippets of what he did during his lifetime. And if it is true that one is not successful until his successor succeeds, then Dr. Saraki was successful. He was successful because his successors have succeeded and they continue to succeed. If it is true that men and women's deed are recognized for their positive contribution to society, then it is true that Dr. Saraki was a man worthy of celebration. I'm glad to be in your distinguished presence to deliver a lecture in his memory and to have that lecture focus on the critical question of leadership in Africa and the critical question of followership in Africa. And the Africa that I talk about is the post-colonial Africa. The Africa which is now divided into 55 countries with 55 boundaries imposed on her. An Africa which is famous as the cradle of mankind. An Africa which is said to be great in prospect. An Africa about which there is much expectation, but an Africa which continues to punch below her weight. That is the Africa that I will be talking about as I focus on the question of leadership and followership. As I think about that Africa and her leadership and followership, and I think about her often, as all of us should, the words of a book that I read as a youngster come to mind. And any one of us who had the opportunity of reading the book A Tale of Two Cities will remember these words. It was the time, the best of times, and the worst of times. It was the age of wisdom and the age of foolishness. It was the epoch of belief and the epoch of incredulity. It was the season of light and the season of darkness. It was the spring of hope and the winter of despair. Those words define the mother continent as we live in her today. Those who commentate about the continent never tire to say that this is a great continent. Those who care about this continent never tire to remember that this continent, divided as she is, has had many leaders. And when I allow my mind to go down memory lane, I can remember so very vividly the immortal words of many great African leaders on the eve of our regaining our independence. And many of us can see pictures of young Africans, whether in Nigeria or Ghana or Algeria or Kenya or Tanzania, celebrating when we regained our independence. And many of us can remember the words that they spoke and the promises that they made. If it was in Nigeria here, you can remember the immortal words about what they would do to Nigeria of Nnamdi Azikiwe. You can remember those words. You can remember the words of Abubakar Tafawa Balewa. You can remember the promises he made. You can remember the erudite words of the Sultan of Sokoto, Ahmadu Bello, and the promises he made, and many others. When they spoke then, those who were young saw in them the similitude of Moses in the Bible. They thought of their leaders and saw their leaders as messiahs who would bedazzle latter-day pharaohs with miracles, who would liberate them from the Egypt of poverty and want, who would cause pillars of fire to stand between them and sorrow and want, who would part the Red Seas of tribalism and ethnicity, who in times of hunger would summon manna and quail from heaven. That is what they thought of their leaders, messiahs. But today, permit me to say, in many African countries they are saying, it was better while we waited. It was better while we waited. There is a sense in which throughout the continent of Africa, there has been disappointment with leaders at all levels. So that when on the eve of independence, we wanted to come home, now that we regained independence, we never tired to see images of our young men and women dying in the Sahara, dying in the Mediterranean Sea, being humiliated at the embassies of the erstwhile colonizers as they seek to leave our countries and the continent. It was better while we waited, they say. Which begs the question, what happened and what is happening? That we have so many individuals who occupy positions of leadership, and yet the biggest deficit is that of leadership in Africa. You know, in 1983, your own countryman, the late Chinua Achebe, wrote a little book which he could well have been writing about Africa, but he focused on Nigeria, the trouble with Nigeria. And Chinua, without mincing words, says the trouble with Nigeria is simply and squarely a problem of leadership. Whether you agree or disagree with Chinua, that is another debate. But he had his perspective. And he was asking a question that we continue to ask about the continent of Africa. Why is it that while on average 60 years after we regained independence, the 55 countries that constitute the continent of Africa, why is it